Greetings, folks, and welcome to another episode of Lessons from the Cockpit. I'm your host, Mark Hasera, and for over 60 years, my passion has been everything aviation and airplanes. For half my adult life, I flew KC-135s. And on this show, we're going to interview some of the most fascinating and intriguing pilots, aircrew members, maintainers, and aviation enthusiasts that I came in contact during those 60 years. And today, we're going to talk to one of those great people that I worked with when I was living in Okinawa, Japan. Special thanks to the sponsor of this show, Wall Pilot, custom aviation art for the walls of your home, office, or hangar. Lessons from the Cockpit investigates some of the tactics, techniques, and procedures these aviators created or cultivated during those extreme and extraordinary military, commercial, and private flying operations. Our exploration gives our listeners practical advice on how does the aviation world work and expands critical thinking skills both in the air and on the ground. Many of the stories that you hear on our show are being told for the very first time. On today's show, my guest is Lieutenant Colonel, retired, Joe Katuzienski, call sign Tazz, one of my best friends. And he's going to tell us some of his lessons learned from flying F-15s and being one of the strategists for the surge in Iraq. So, grab an adult beverage of your choice, sit down, strap in, and let's begin this episode of Lessons from the Cockpit with my good friend Tazz.
We're old men now.
Oh, I know, man. Look at that. Gray hair and all.
Yeah.
Gray hair and all, man. Man, I can't thank you enough for coming on. This is great.
You bet. Thanks for asking me. This is an honor. I'm really happy to be here.
Well, you and I go back a long way when both of us had hair.
Yeah. Yeah, I know. It's been almost 30 years, I think, right? 93?
Yeah. 1993, brother.
Yep.
Can you believe that, man?
Not a whole lot's changed over those years either, has it?
No, unfortunately. We've gotten a little wiser, hopefully.
Well, Thanks for inviting me, Sluggo. This is an honor and a pleasure. I really mean it. This is great.
Well, I appreciate you taking the time.
Really informative. I mean, you're sharing some stories and telling some things that are really important. As I meet a bunch of airmen, I talk to captains at my airline, and I've talked with this 8th Air Force World War II veteran the other day. What a great guy. What a great guy. They all kind of say the same thing. No one really tells the story. This is an 8th Air Force World War II veteran said, I went to war with these guys. We were blood brothers. And then all of a sudden we got thrown together ad hoc. We flew these missions. We went home and that was it. And we all came back home and said, what did we just do?
I know. When you and I came back from Desert Storm, it was the same thing. What did I just get myself involved with? What did I just do?
Yep.
You're flying the Eagle. And I mean, to think about that, Tazz, I didn't even know you were covering us on one of our missions.
Yeah.
When we were up there pulling those F-16s out and covering Devin Jones' pickup. Mm-hmm. I had no idea you guys were even there.
Yeah.
NUACS didn't tell us, and we're all kind of nervous because we're kind of deep inside of Iraq, covering all this, doing what we had to do.
That mission took a long time.
It did. It was interesting because toward the end of it, we're still in Iraq. We're covering Devin Jones's pickup. For all the listeners, Devin Jones and his Rio got shot down on an F-14 the night before. The Rio gets picked up by the Iraqis, and we pick up Devin Jones. And it's a really incredible story of how that happened.
Yeah.
And I'm kind of wondering, man, we're kind of hanging it out up here. There's no F-15s around. And yet Tazz is above us at, what were you, like 32,000 feet? We were down in the 21 to 22 block, if I remember right.
Yeah, we swept north. There were some Sandies clearing out the area. They took out an armored column of, I think, armored infantry going after one of the survivors.
Yeah, P.J. Johnson.
Yeah, then they got lit up by it was a mobile SAM. I don't know if it was an SA-8 or what, but they got lit up with something. The Pablos got in there and got the survivor, and that was huge. But that mission seemed to take forever. I remember thinking, we went to the tanker 2 or 3 times as the Pablo helicopters are going in for the pickup at the time. It just seemed like it took forever. Of course, your eyeballs are out looking around, waiting for any threat. But yeah, that day there were no air-to-air threats, just surface-to-air threats. But we got them out. That was quite a mission. That was awesome.
Well, and the thing, Tazz, that we had to do there was we were still refueling the Weasels. And then the A-10s needed gas. And so we went into this big wagon wheel, like you saw us, okay? So one guy could slow down and get the hogs. A couple of us could stay fast and refuel the weasels because they flowed back into Iraq also. Yeah. And that mission was purely ad hoc. I wrote about it in the book. Are you guys coming in to fly? Yes, we're coming to fly. Your mission's canceled. You're doing this now. And it was like, okay, here we go. It was we're going into Iraq to pick up F-16s that didn't get pre-strike refueled. And the thing is I had my camera with me on the cockpit floor, and my co-pilot had his video camera with him. So we took pictures of this thing and video this thing like crazy. It's an amazing thing.
Yeah, that was quite awesome.
Man, if you and I get going like this, man, this is going to take all night.
It's all right. Like I said, I'm glad you're telling these stories because that 8th Air Force World War II veteran, Freddie Bichetti, U.S. Bomber Crew 2366, that was his bomber crew number, B-24 Bombardier. He said, we're not telling the story. So he wants to talk about it. He still has his mind. He's 98 years old. He's really sharp. And
we got to get him on.
I'm going to meet with him. It's going to be hard. He's hard to get a hold of, but I'll ambush him once when I go see my mom.
We'll figure out how to get him on.
What a great guy though. What a great American. And he said he was only 20 years old at the time.
I know, that's the thing. There are all these young guys going into combat like this, flying in airplanes like B-24s with like 10 guns in them and stuff like that, trying to shoo away all the ME-109s, the Focke-Wulf 190s, all these things that are going on.
Right.
And then live to tell about it and live good long lives, for crying out loud,
Yeah, he served, he was in Europe from May of 1944 through late August, early September of 44. And at that time, you had to complete 35 missions, and then you were sent home. Not everyone on the crew completed the missions. The flight engineer had a nervous breakdown and had to go to an institution after going on a raid over Berlin. So they lost him. Their navigator was killed. He decided that he was a really good navigator, so the bomb group wanted him there. And he stayed on for a bunch of other missions, and he was killed on one of them. But the rest of the crew made it back home. It's quite a story. I mean, these guys are just amazing. They had to bail out once because they were above the weather and they didn't have instruments to land. They had to find a hole in the clouds. The pilot at the time didn't think they were going to be able to go through the weather, so he ordered everybody to bail out. Freddie's a 20-year-old bombardier telling everybody on the crew how to put on the parachute to bail out. And he looked at me and laughed. He says, "Can you believe that? Here I am, 20 years old, telling these my bomber crewmen how to bail out." But the co-pilot and captain stayed with the airplane. They were able to find a hole through the weather and they got it back safely. So they didn't have to bail out, but they did on that mission. So it's a pretty interesting story talking to this guy. And he didn't think he was going to make it. He did not think he was going to make it.
And think about this, Tazz. You're a captain in 737s right now, moving up here pretty soon. You're also an aero engineer too. Think about the difference between the instruments he was flying with and the instruments you are flying with. They don't have ILS. They don't have any of that kind of stuff. The multifunction displays that we have now give us incredible information. The advanced visuals on the thing, where you can see the ground and everything.
We don't have HUDs in our fleet, but there are HUDs.
Yeah.
Gulfstreams where there's an infrared look through the HUD, and you can actually see through the weather. You can see.
They have it on the captain's side, okay? And Rockwell Collins makes that stuff. And I remember going into the sim and playing with that in Aspen, Colorado. That's where they train guys on this in snowy weather in Aspen, Colorado, because you're surrounded by mountains. Missed approach procedure is like crazy. And if you don't follow it, you hit a mountain. Here you are like 8-9 miles out from the runway. And there it is right there in front of you on a piece of glass with all the terrain around you, all the buildings around you. Crazy stuff. Crazy stuff, man.
We've come a long way. There's no doubt.
We have come a long way.
It's been a pleasure. I think the latest upgrades with the touch screen displays, ADS-B in and out that we have now has really revolutionized the industry, really. And the iPad now, you can't fly without your iPad. I mean, if you don't have an iPad in the airlines, you have to get one. You can't MEL that iPad. You have to get an iPad to do it. That tells you how far we've come. It's pretty amazing. It's a really, for me, flying in the airlines right now it's been a pleasure. I flew 1,000 hours over the past 2 years throughout the pandemic. I've seen the world, literally the world change.
Yeah.
From an airman's perspective, it's been it's been interesting. I did not expect to fly combat missions for the airlines, but we ended up doing something similar because people were scared, Sluggo. I'm telling you, people were scared. But one of the most illuminating things I remember, deplane the airplane at Dulles, and I'm walking to the train, the subway train, whatever. And an FBI agent walks up to me. There's FBI agents quite often. We fly. Yeah, they're everywhere. But he came up to me, he looks at me and goes, "I really admire your courage." I said, "Aren't you an FBI agent?" He goes, "Yeah." I said, "Why are you telling me this?" Because you're flying throughout this pandemic. And I really admire that. And this is an FBI agent, a law enforcement officer.
Yeah.
That blew me away. I did not expect that. So I've had people come up to me totally unsolicited and thank, as a pilot flying the airlines at the time. And it's been interesting. We've flown a lot of vaccines all over the world. One of the more interesting flights, there's a flight from, I think I told you this, from San Francisco to Washington, D.C. We only had 2 or 3 passengers. This was in the middle of the pandemic, June of 2020. Mm-hmm. No one was flying, but we loaded the airplane up with produce from Hawaii. There were cases of cilantro. You know what cilantro is? You put it on your...
yeah.
And that airplane smelled great. They loaded the overhead bins with cilantro. Cases of cilantro are everywhere. The belly cargo was full of cilantro. We took off like a rocket because we were so light. We had 1 or 2 passengers in first class. That was one of the more memorable flights. We didn't see anyone on TCAS from San Francisco to Washington Dulles. Not a single hit. And if I remember right, Cleveland Center was shut down at the time because some of their radar, their high altitude controllers they popped positive for COVID. But yeah, it was really it was like the Twilight Zone flying through all that. But I'm glad I did it. And we stayed safe. We had procedures in place to keep us from getting sick.
Yeah.
And I know I probably had it 2 or 3 times. I never tested positive because I didn't feel that bad where I had to go. Yeah, I'm pretty sure I had it. I just don't know. I just don't know for sure.
What you don't know won't hurt you.
Yeah, but these are great stories you're telling, Sluggo. I mean, we got to get the word out on aviation. In my opinion, I think it's a great thing.
See, I want to focus. The reason I did this was because of guys like you and me that have all of this aviation experience, particularly in your case, because you're an aero engineer, you flew F-15s, you've been flying since you were a kid, went into the airlines, you were planning missions as a joint partner with our guys in Baghdad. And so you have all this joint experience too. So Right. It's not just for the airplanes, but it's also for guys that are still in the military doing stuff. But particularly, a lot of that applies to just business, dealing with your business partners and your customers. And that's why I did this. I want to take all of this knowledge that guys like Freddie has and pass it down, like pay it forward to people that are just coming up. I got to talk to a aviation school, ground school the other day down in Salem. It was all these young high school kids that are, oh my gosh, what is it like flying airplanes? And I remember telling them, you guys are coming into the aviation industry at absolutely the best time, probably in the world's history, because we're going to need 600,000 pilots, according to this article I read, between now and 2030. You guys will be gainfully employed for a long time. Guys like you and me need to take all of this stuff we got in our heads and do the Vulcan mind meld with these guys. And that was the reason I created this podcast, to focus on here's the story, here's what I learned from it.
Yeah, it's a great podcast. You mentioned I'm an aerospace, I have an aerospace engineering degree, but I'm a pilot with an engineering degree. Now, I go to a airport and fly sailplanes, and there are rocket scientists and really, no kidding, NASA engineers. They're brilliant engineers with a pilot's license. So there's a difference between being a pilot with an aerospace engineering degree and an aerospace with a pilot's license.
And a rocket scientist with a...
I want to let people know I'm a pilot with a aero engineering degree, because at the time when I was going to the University of Kansas, that was what the Air Force wanted. They wanted pilots with an engineering degree. So that's why I went into the aerospace engineering field. And I'm glad I did. It was illuminating. The professors there at the time were brilliant. One man, he's still alive, Dr. Jan Roscom. who was a student of Dr. Theodore von Karman, who's the famous aerodynamicist from World War II.
Yeah, you and I have talked about him before.
Yeah, he was one of von Karman's students. And boy, this Dr. Roskin was absolutely brilliant. He was our stability and control engineer. I learned so much from him. I'm still learning about stability and control at different phases of flight in the airline industry and flying.
And different aspects of our life.
Yeah, absolutely, yeah. It's been quite it's been a great experience. I wouldn't trade it for the world.
Hey,
did you want to ask me some questions about?
Yeah, I do. Okay. Let's go back in our history a little bit. All right. Kim Il-sung dies and we're capping on the DMZ. You remember that?
Yeah.
You told me that was one of the few times you actually went master arm on in the airplane against, I think it was a fish bed or something like that. Why don't you relate that story and some of the lessons that you learned from being on a hot border, looking across, because right now our guys in Poland, maybe other parts of Europe, are doing the exact same thing.
Yeah. Well, that wasn't near the DMZ in North Korea. This was in Desert Shield, the Desert Storm. I didn't come real close to getting an engagement. There was a guy in our squadron called Muscles Mahoney. He was one of our fighter pilots at the time, and he came really close. He armed hot and took on a couple MiG-29s that almost crossed the border in the Saudi airspace at the time. During my Gulf War I experience, I armed hot and chased two MiG-29s into Iran. We were escorting a strike package into Baghdad. Middle of the day, broad daylight. Yeah, Rivet Joint said, hey, you got a couple guys 40 miles to your east about to take off, two MiG-29s. They'll be airborne in 1 minute. You need to vector east. So we did. And sure enough, there were the MiG-29s, and they were on we had an intercept going. We were heading about 090. The MiGs were heading about 340, 330. They were in close formation. And as soon as I lit them up with my radar, I armed hot. I didn't have a weapon solution yet. I was cleared to kill, but they turned. And I was happy to get them to turn because I did not want to. I didn't want to get those guys anywhere close to this strike package that was going in.
Yeah.
We were escorting, I think, about maybe 60. There were a lot of airplanes. There were about 60 F-16s in this one particular strike. But yeah, we got them to turn, and I just wanted to moonwalk my way back to the strike package, keeping my radar on them as chased them into Iran. And we went all the way out to over Basra, and I looked down and I saw the Republican Guard divisions below me, 10,000 feet below me as I chased these MiGs. The MiGs were at treetop level, literally at treetop level, going as fast as they can go. We were happy to get rid of them. I looked down after almost crossing into Iranian airspace, and there was these Republican Guard divisions southwest of Basra. And I still can't believe, Slugger, to this day, they didn't shoot up at us. They didn't shoot SAM up at our. Yeah. And the only thing I'm thinking is maybe they were weapons tight because they knew they had friendlies in the air. I'm still blown away by that. Now, I know it's hard to see when you're getting shot at in the daytime. You don't see the muzzle flashes of the AAA. You don't see the tracing rounds coming up at you like you do at night.
Yeah.
A SAM, you don't see when a SAM comes up at you, there's a big glow of light and this thing starts to snake its way up toward you. You can see that at night, but in the daytime, it's pretty tough to see things if they're coming up at you. But we weren't lit up to the best of my knowledge, and we were able to get our strikers into the target area and go back home. But that was the only time. Another time I armed hot and MiG-23 actually crashed probably 30 miles in front of us. We don't know why. He just hit the desert and blew up. But we didn't fire at him. But those are the only two times I armed hot to engage enemy fighters. So I mean, there was a lot of guys that did a lot more than me. I was just a lieutenant wingman doing my job, but there were other guys that did a lot more heroic stuff in that war. It was quite an experience. A lot of guys did a lot of good work. I was just one of them that happened to be there.
But think about our guys that are in Poland now flying caps, man. They're going through the same mental process you were going through, okay. The other day I was talking to a Viper guy, Pig Fleischman. He said, I had to pull off a guy because if I had hit him with the missile, he would have fallen in the fly zone, okay, and would have caused an international incident.
Yeah, yeah.
And I don't know if you saw today, Zelensky was talking to Congress and he's going, we need a no-fly zone. We need a no-fly zone. We need a no-fly zone. And I'm like going, This is an interesting time. This is the Cold War all over again. This is 1950 Korea.
The North Korean army just came south of the 38th parallel and pushed our boys all the way to Pusan, into the Pusan perimeter. This is what's happening, in my opinion anyway, in Ukraine right now. And it's just a tragedy. A bit of good news. The last captain I flew with, a guy named Captain Jones, great guy. You got to talk to this guy. He married a Ukrainian woman. His mother-in-law was living in Ukraine, and this was early January. And I said, Chris, what's going on? Is your mother-in-law still in Ukraine? Oh, yeah. He was very confident at the time that Putin would not invade Ukraine. Yeah. Saber rattling, because he had the Crimea. And what Chris told me was, he's got the Crimea. He doesn't need anything else. I don't think he's going to invade. Well, sure enough, 2 weeks later, he invaded, right? So, But I got some good news from him today. He said, my mother-in-law just arrived in Reston, Virginia, Washington, D.C. area. She was able to escape to Poland. And this is a woman in her 70s. She was able to escape to Poland, get to the U.S. consulate in Krakow. They were able to get her to the U.S. on a visa. So that was good news. When I heard that, I was like, yeah, that's awesome.
Good.
That is awesome. So that's one. I was worried about his mother-in-law for a while there. Even though I never met the lady, I was feeling for my my crewmate there. Yeah. So there's some good things happening.
Tazz, talk about your work as a strategist for the surge.
The surge in Iraq?
Yeah. So explain a little bit what that was, what your job was, and relate to us. Here's what it's like working with all these different agencies in order to make the plan come together.
I was there for 2 deployments. The one in 2005, I was on the ground in Baghdad at the Baghdad International Airport. I was the OSS commander at the time. And then we worked closely with the 3rd Infantry Division from 2005 to 2006. And that was at the Baghdad Airport. That was quite an experience. I got to know the guys from 3rd ID, great Americans, all of them. I was so frustrated in the way the war was being conducted at that, just keeping the APOD, the aerial port of debarkation, we called them APODs, keeping the C-5s and C-17s and C-130s flowing in and out of Baghdad was really important. Came up with a great concept at the tactical level, at that airbase level, and we maximized the throughput, and we had more passengers and cargo ever by the end of our tour by some of the methods we used. So I was still frustrated. So I said, this is stupid, but I'm going to go back for another year to the KAOC because this surge in Iraq is coming up, and I want to see if I can apply some of these lessons learned at a higher level of war, at the operational level in the Combined Air Operations Center with 9th Air Force Forward. So I did that, and that was there was so much going on at that time, so much going on. I learned that you needed persistent surveillance over the battlefield. You needed persistent surveillance keyed with ground maneuver to be really highly effective. We learned this in Baghdad. And how do you apply that at the operational level? Great American you need to talk to, Sluggo, Colonel Gary Crowder, retired U.S. Air Force. He was our AOC commander.
I know Chowder. Chowder was working in the Kosovo KAOC. He was the strategist during Kosovo too.
He's brilliant, and he's still around. He worked for General Short. General Short was a CFAC, I think, at the time you're talking about, right? So
and Trexler was the deputy.
Yeah, I worked for Trexler when he was 7th Air Force. Yeah,
another great guy.
But the surge. Okay, so the surge in Iraq. Gary Chowder, and the strategy division guys. I was part of the strategy division in the camp. How can we support General Petraeus, who was the commander on the ground at multinational force Iraq? His strategy was to clear, hold, and build in Iraq. So clear out the enemy, hold the ground, and then build up that ground so we can transition that battle space over to the Iraqis. That was the simplified strategy: clear, hold, and build. Okay, it made sense from a counterinsurgency standpoint. This is the same strategy that was used in Vietnam after General Westmoreland left and General Abrams took over after the Tet Offensive. They called it something different, but it was essentially a clear, hold, and build strategy. So how do you apply air power to that? Well, Colonel Crowder was a brilliant guy. I've got the book right here. I'll show you the book we actually used to do this. It's called A Better War by Louis Sorley. A Better War.
Okay.
Clear, hold, and build. It talks about General Abrams and what he did to secure victory. A lot of Americans don't know this, but in Vietnam, we did extremely well after the Tet Offensive. We did these, the U.S. Army just did great work under General Abrams. Colonel Crowder knew that in 2007, and he said, Petraeus is using this strategy. And there's a book called A Better War by Louis Sorley. Buy that book. Let's read it. And let's figure out how we can integrate air power into this clear, hold, and build strategy. And that's what we did. To do that was really tough. You mentioned earlier about joint and combined ops, different interagencies working together with different forces. That only works at the speed of trust. If you don't trust the other people working in those other various components, the ground component, the naval component, the air and space component, whatever, you don't trust each other, nothing's going to happen, right? So you got to have people that can build relationships and build trust and earn that trust by doing the right things at the right time. That's basically what we did. I mean, it was tough. My first night, I'll never forget that night. We talked about it, how I was introduced to the folks at the KOC. I got a C-130 that night and went to Baghdad. I wasn't welcomed at first, but we went to, we started out with the air liaison officers at the division level, part of the theater air control system, the TACS, as we called it. Go to the ALOs and they can introduce you to the soldiers. And that's how we worked it. We stayed within our command and control structure, got introduced to soldiers who were planning the next operation. And it was, lo and behold, it was the 3rd Infantry Division again. The same guys I knew a couple years earlier in Baghdad, they were still there. They went home and came back just like me. It was just, it all came together. Developed a clear hold and build strategy to support 3rd Infantry in the southern regions of Baghdad. The main effort was in Sadr City. 1st Cab was there, I think. 1st Cavalry was at that time in an urban fight. That was the main effort. But General Lynch, Major General Lynch, commanding general of 3rd ID at the time, really needed air power to clear out these areas south of Baghdad. So we applied this clear hold and build strategy developed by General Abrams and applied it to General Lynch's problem. And General North, our commanding Air Force general at the time, he was our combined force air component commander, the big boss. General Lynch, General Lynch and General North became really good friends. They got to know each other, and that's how we started the surge. We started it with 3rd Infantry in the south and expanded it throughout Iraq, and it worked really well. And we applied some of the same techniques in Afghanistan as well, although that's a whole different story. That's how we fought the surge from an air power perspective. Real basically, when you do a clearing operation, you need to provide intelligence, surveillance, and reconnaissance of the areas you're interested in to develop an idea of what the enemy forces are doing in that area. We use the rule of thumb of about 2 weeks. And so what does that mean? 2 weeks prior to ground forces moving across that terrain and clearing it out. 2 weeks prior, we did what we called an ISR soak with different sensors from different platforms in space, air breathing platforms, overhead platforms, whatever. We all integrated this intelligence and we developed an idea of what the enemy forces were doing in that area. It worked well in that context. And that's how we fought in Iraq. Clear, hold, and build. All the way from Marne Torch was the first operation under General Lynch. I think that started in June of 2007. Just like North Africa, it was Operation Torch. Well, 3rd ID called it Marne Torch because 3rd Infantry is the Rock of the Marne, or one. So they named their operation Marne Torch. Then there was Marne Anvil, and it led up to Marne Thunderbolt, which was in January, I think, of 2008. But Marne Thunderbolt was one of the last operations I helped plan and coordinate. But that's how we did it. It was a big success at the time. It's a shame that no one knows about. Well, in my opinion, after talking with people at different stages after leaving the Air Force after retiring, a lot of people don't know what happened in Iraq. They don't know what the ebb and flow of the battles were. And there was a lot that went on there. I mean, there was a lot. And you go to the library today. Last time I went to a library, you get everything online now, right? But the last time I went to a library, there wasn't a whole lot of books on the Iraq War. There's a lot of books on, God bless them, the special forces guys, great guys. Yeah. But the conventional force side, I don't see a whole lot of written on that. So
no.
3rd Infantry has a lot to say about what happened in Iraq. And those guys they're my heroes. There's no doubt.
Well, and I'm sure coordinating this intelligence, surveillance, and reconnaissance deck with all of the different services having different assets, you had to figure out, okay, what's the best asset for this particular information that I need?
Yeah.
And so you had to go and coordinate all of that too, with the Army, with the Navy, with the guys on the ground. The Special Forces guys are running around gathering intelligence too. And during the invasion, they were even feeding that to us because they were telling us, okay, well, here's where his science projects are underneath the tanker tracks. I remember you telling me that air power kind of sat on a 3-legged stool. Persistent ISR, continuous joint fires, and I think the other one was, persistent joint fires and consistent humanitarian operations. I think those were the 3.
Humanitarian operations, yeah.
Is that the 3?
That's the 3, yeah. Persistent ISR integrated fires, which can mean anything from electronic or kinetic or even an illumination flare at night. That would be one way to integrate fires from a howitzer cannon, for example.
Mm-hmm.
And humanitarian relief operations, really any type of movement on the ground. You could call it humanitarian relief. You could call it a clearing operation with mechanized infantry. It doesn't matter. It's got to be something on the ground. It could be something at sea, but it has to be coordinated with those movements. Otherwise, ISR is just, in my opinion, being thrown away. And there's a way to, General Lynch wasn't going to get his air power. When we first got up there, we had to tell him, sir, you're just a 2-star general. I'm just a lieutenant colonel, right? I just said, sir, you really need to name your operation. He goes, what do you mean name my operation? We're just going to go into the Arab Jabur district south of Baghdad and clear it out. Sir, we need to name this something, because if you don't name your operation something, it will not be as high on the air tasking order in order of priority. So if you name it something, he named, anyway, they were brilliant. They named it Marne Torch. He was able to get his air power prioritized in a way that suited him and met his needs. And it was just an amazing experience. But yeah, you're right. Persistent ISR, integrated fires, ground maneuver, or humanitarian relief operations. That's what the ISR, integrated fires, and the HUMRO stuff was what we did in Baghdad at the Baghdad International Airport, right? We did humanitarian relief. We evacuated wounded civilians. We put them on medical medevacs, and so that was our version of HUMRO. But we got a lot of intelligence by doing those types of things.
Yeah.
And that kept us safe. Those soldiers out there clearing the wire, they kept us safe. Yeah. A lot of them gave their lives too, Sluggo. It was a bloody time. Let me just put it this way. I stopped counting because they would bring the soldiers that were killed in action, and Marines too. M&F West was right there. The scene for the Marine Corps was right there by our airfield. I stopped counting at 200. 200 dead Americans is when I stopped counting.
Oh,
I would take names, and I took it and made a little diary of each event. The chaplain would get on board the C-130 and he'd say a prayer before sending the soldiers back to Germany. But yeah, at 200, I said, this is crazy. I'm not going to keep this diary anymore. And I think we lost over 350 Americans when I was there in Baghdad. So that's why I wanted to go back to the KAOC a couple years later and see if I could make a difference at the operational level. I hope I did. I don't know. I mean, I tried. So that's all you can do, right?
It's amazing too, because sometimes you don't know if you did or not. And sometimes it's like years later that you figure out, oh, wow, I was involved with that. Maybe we did make a difference. So give us an example of integrated fires. When you're talking integrated fires, what does that mean to somebody that's not in our business? And our listeners, when they hear that, just give them an example of joint integrated fires.
Sure. Well, I could start with a really strange example.
Those are always the best ones, man.
One that you won't hear anywhere else, but probably here. Let me just give you an example. Baghdad, and you got to talk to some of my tower controllers that was in my squadron at the time, but they were giving clearance for takeoff for Jordanian Airways. I don't know. I think they had MD-11s at the time, or an Airbus. They were given clearance for a Jordanian Airways airliner to take off while a mile off the runway center line, right in line with runway 33 left, if I remember correctly. About a mile north of the runway, there was a battery of 105 millimeter howitzer guns from the 10th Mountain Division, and they were firing illumination flares at night because there were obviously some clearing operations with infantry clearing out some of the areas around the airport because bad guys are out there, right? So these tower controllers are giving clearance. Jordanian Airways 101, for example, cleared takeoff, runway 33 left, climb, runway heading, maintain 4,000, whatever. They were doing that while these guns were going off slow, though. So that's a way to integrate fires with civilian air operations. A lot of times in the military, you think about integrating fires with supporting infantry or mechanized forces on the ground or at sea, dropping bombs on the bad guys for close air support. But that's the way we integrated fires in Baghdad. We took those howitzers. They had to illuminate the battle space at night, and we're still able to safely, allow civilian air operations to continue to operate because it was important. We had to keep that airport open. We had to bring C-130s with medical supplies in while those guns were going off.
Yeah.
Helicopters still needed to take off and land from the airport. C-5s came in at night delivering cargo. Same thing with C-17s. We had to do that. The guns had to keep firing. They had to fire. Most of it was illumination flares. But we had 105s to the north, and 3rd Infantry had the big 155 howitzers to the south. So those guns were going off. Before we got there, when there was one illumination flare fired, all the air operations in Baghdad were shut down because of that one illumination flare. So we looked at this and said, we can't do this. We can't fight a war just because we're firing flares. We need to figure out a way to do this. And those airmen in the control tower did that. Pretty amazing how they did it. We did it, and I think it really paid big dividends. So that's an example of integrated fires. Now, another example that we're familiar with is providing close air support to forces in close contact with the enemy. For example, in Afghanistan, we would have A-10s go in and Strike Eagles, F-15Es go in and drop ordnance on bad guys on a mountaintop while we have special forces or conventional ground forces somewhere in the area close by calling in for that air support. That's the way to integrate fires in a kinetic way to support soldiers on the ground. So there's two ways of doing it. The weird way nobody talks about, you got guns, you got airliners, you got to keep the airport open, or you could drop bombs on the bad guys in a hot firefight. It was pretty amazing, this whole concept. And the persistent ISR piece, real quickly on that, we had an aerostat, which is a blimp. Literally, it's the Goodyear blimp on a 2,500 foot tether. And this was not just the Goodyear blimp. It had some high-tech sensors on it, some infrared and full motion video sensors. And these sensors were cued with acoustic sensors and whatnot all around the perimeter of the airfield. So if there was a pop, bang, or a fizz anywhere around the airfield, the sensors on this blimp, which is 2,500 feet above the airfield, would slew in that direction, and they would see where the bad guys are. So we had to keep that blimp flying slow, though. We had to keep it flying. So we redesigned our instrument approaches to allow airplanes to take off and land while that blimp was in the air. Never did that before, but we had to do that. And I think that's another thing that kept us safe. God bless the guys who did that. It was amazing. They got it to work. They had to go to Europe. They had to literally go to Europe and talk to the guys who design instrument approaches, the TERPS people, we call them, the terminal approach procedure people.
Yeah.
The obstacle was an aerostat on the airfield. How can we get around that and still do a VOR approach or localizer approach? And they did that. But we had to keep that blimp in the air because we needed that persistent surveillance overhead, looking at what's going on to keep us safe. And it worked.
Hey, I remember you telling me a story about that blimp where you would reel it into like the bottom of the base of the clouds and they'd start firing at it or something like that. And then you guys developed some kind of plan to come in and find who was firing at it, where they were firing at it, and put the hurt on them.
Yeah. Well, the blimp had to come down because of high winds. And when the weather got really bad, they would lower it to a lower altitude. But before we had any of these instrument approaches designed, they would bring the blimp all the way down to its mooring on the ground. And that would take, I don't know, I can't remember, 10 or 15 minutes to do that. It took a while. And when that happens, Baghdad's got, it's a big city. I can't remember the population, but it's well over 1 million.
Yeah.
I mean, everybody sees the blimp come down. And these blimps have sensors and cameras, and there's guys looking through the camera lenses, and they're looking at guys on roofs on cell phones pointing at the blimp as it goes down. Sure enough, those were some of the bad guys, and we would get mortar and rocket fire coming on the base when the blimp was in its mooring. So it took a while to figure that out. And we're not that bright, right? But after a while, we figured, hey, when the weather's bad, they start shooting at us. So if we can design instrument approaches to keep this blimp flying, let's see if we can do that. And we did. And our boss, Colonel Malone at the time, he was all for it. And that was one of the good things he did, actually. We got those procedures to work.
Yeah. I remember you telling me that you had howitzers that you're dropping in on top of these guys. And
yep.
I think Apache helicopters that were flying around and special forces guys that are hunting these guys down. I mean, that is joint integrated fires, for crying out loud. When you've got that kind of a group of folks working together, and just for a balloon, man. Okay.
Guys working together don't trust each other. It's not going to work. You got to build a level of trust. We did with our Iraqi counterparts. I don't know if there was a commercial. I got to just tell you this story. When we first got into Baghdad, when I first got there, we weren't really welcome. I didn't feel a lot of love from the Iraqi people, but our group commander at the time was a great guy. And he said, let's go talk to the Iraqi Civil Aeronautics Authority, the FAA in Iraq. Let's go talk to these guys. They're in the civil terminal. We're not going to bring our guns. We're not going to bring our weapons. We're not going to bring our body armor. We're just going to go in uniform. I said, okay. And we did that. And we started building trust with our Iraqi civilian counterparts. Mm-hmm. And we started doing these humanitarian relief missions. And some of these civilians, Sluggo, I'm telling you, there were some really badly wounded civilians. We got them on airliners to take them to a Jordanian hospital. Jordanian Airways was one of the airlines. Mm-hmm. And the people that worked in the airport, there were a lot of people. It was a big airport. They saw all this. And toward the end of our tour, we would go into that building and talk to these Iraqi, aeronautics officials. His office was on the top floor, whatever. We had to go through the terminal where there's a lot of people. They started toward the end of our tour, they saw all these humanitarian relief operations. They saw how we cared for the people. They would come out from behind the kitchen and clap. I would see cooks clapping, giving us a thumbs up. Hey, the Americans are coming back. All right. They loved us. It blew me away. I didn't expect that.
And nobody hears about that, Tazz.
It was amazing.
Nobody's heard that story.
I'm not making that up. I saw a cook come out from behind in the kitchen because he knew the Americans, everybody saying the Americans are coming. A few airmen would walk down the hallway and the terminal building, the bag, the luggage racks and all that stuff, the luggage carousels, people would come up and just clap and thumbs up. It was just amazing. Talking hundreds of people, not just onesies and twosies. There were hundreds of people in that terminal and they all gave us a thumbs up and they loved us. It was amazing. It's just something else.
And because they trust you, they're also feeding you stuff too, aren't they? They're giving you information.
They were, yeah. They were sharing information. But it was quite an experience. So
I'll bet. Now, what's going on in Afghanistan at this same time? Because you're doing strategy in Iraq and Afghanistan at the same time, aren't you?
Throughout the whole U.S. CENTCOM AOR, which includes portions of Africa like Djibouti and all throughout Southwest Asia, Iran included. Afghanistan was another fight. That was a whole different theater. The resources from an airpower perspective were a lot scarcer. So we had to come up with a plan on how to maximize the use of resources to enable the folks on the ground to do their job. We learned from a couple airmen in Baghdad how they used intelligence to capture bad guys on one of the main supply routes. It was called MSR Tampa. It came from the south. We called it MSR Tampa. It's just a 2-lane highway. But convoys would go up and down MSR Tampa to supply the forces. It was one of the highways in Iraq. There was Senior Airman Pena, was 10th Mountain Division, 2nd Brigade. He was one of the guys that came up with this scheme. He said, one of the ALOs, Rock was his call sign. Funny name, his last name was Hudson, but he didn't look like Rock Hudson. He was the 3rd Infantry Division ALO. He says, you got to talk to these guys from 10th Mountain. Come here, you got to meet Airman Pena. So he explained how he used intel to predict where the bad guys would show up to try to blow up our soldiers on the ground. And he was really effective along MSR Tampa, a senior airman came up with this concept. And I said, this is a great idea. So we took this idea to Afghanistan.
This kid's only like 20, 22 years old then.
Oh, yeah, he was a young guy. But his concepts were right. They're right out of joint doctrine. How to predict where the enemy is going to show up based on what you've seen him do in the past. Basically, that was the gist of it.
Yeah, so patterns of life, man. Establish a pattern of life.
We did that in Afghanistan because we had the Highway 1 road was roughly about 3,400 kilometers. You know what Highway 1 is. It's a big dirt highway that goes around the perimeter of the country, basically. 3,400 kilometers of Highway 1, and there was IEDs going off, killing our soldiers. I mean,
everywhere.
A lot, right? So we took Senior Airman Pena's idea, and we brainstormed with the guys in Afghanistan saying, hey, you guys got limited ISR resources. You don't have everything you want when you need it. But look at what these airmen did for, 2nd of the 10th here in Baghdad. You think you could do that on Highway 1 to look at your 3,400 kilometers of roadway? Yes, they came up with a way to predict where the next IEDs would go off and position air power assets somewhere in the vicinity to respond. It's like knowing where to, put your bobber in the water to catch a fish. You got to be there at the right time of day, at the right fishing hole, the right day of the week. We came up with that concept. We didn't. The guys in Afghanistan did. And we were able to predict where these IEDs were going to go off next. And it was really interesting. Out of the 3,400 kilometers of Highway 1, 70 of those kilometers involved like 80% of the IED attacks. There were 70 kilometers of the 3,400 that were the most important as far as activity was concerned.
That's not very much.
No, when you look at it, but this is what they broke down this mission set. They used all the data they can, figuring out when these bombs would go off. Lo and behold, all that data was recorded for over a year in some big computer somewhere, I think in Washington, D.C. We don't know where that was. I'm just the guy coming up with ideas. I don't know where all the electrons go, but this data was recorded and they were able to correlate days of the week and times and predict with really good accuracy when the bad guys would try to blow our soldiers up. And when you look at this took place in December of 07 through March of 08. When you look at November, December, January, February, March in Afghanistan from 07 to 08, the amount of IED attacks dropped significantly because this concept of operations went into place. We learned all this from a senior airman in Baghdad, and we brought it to the operational level, briefed the deputy CFAC in Afghanistan. Major General Muleman was his name, a Dutch 2-star. Great guy. He loved it. And he told his guys to get on it and come up with a concept of operations. Yeah. They knew where to go to get the intel and predict where to put their assets. In fact, the numbers were pretty astounding. I was just looking at my notes before coming to this meeting here today, Slogo. And it was something like 44. We had 44 tips. We called them tips in December. Then up to like 150 in January of 08, meaning there's 150 activities going on where guys are trying to blow soldiers up. Jeez. And by February and March, the numbers were like 250, approaching 300. So that's how successful we were. And there was a lot of kinetic activity when we saw the bad guys digging holes or trying to blow soldiers up.
You tripled them in 1 month?
When you look at the amount of soldiers killed in Iraq and in Afghanistan, November 07 to March of 08, drop off. The roadside bombs dropped off significantly. I don't know what happened after that because I left, but that was one of the operations I was real proud of.
I have a similar story that I heard from somebody about that too. An AC-130 gunship guy, sensor operator, was like going, hey, what's that disturbed dirt or whatever here in the middle of the road? He got really curious about it. He went back, told some of his bros about it and said, well, the joint stars can kind of figure that out. And of course, some of our other national assets can follow these guys to and from. And believe it or not, they developed this whole plan of dealing with IEDs. I think it was in Baghdad, all because this one young captain saw this disturbed dirt and started asking questions. And what it was, the disturbed dirt obviously is where they put the IED in the road. Mm-hmm. They went to the joint stars. The joint stars above us were like going, well, let us go back and look at our tapes. Oh, well, here's a car that's stopping here and here and here and here and here. Oh, wow, that correlates with exactly where you were marking the spot. The JSTARS guys were saying, oh, well, we know where they went, point of origin back here to this location, this house or whatever. And so what they did was they sent the special ops guys to the house, and sure enough, big, huge IED factory. They started developing that and said, okay, we got to put all this together. And they were able to go back and look at all of the previous data and take that sensor and see, okay, here's that signature, here's that signature. They were even able to figure out when they had a howitzer round behind a guardrail because of the heat signature. It was really weird. The same thing happened, man. When they were able to go and figure all that out, you know, they'd see a car stopping. The Joint Stars guys would see a car stopping, then stopping again, then stopping again, and then stopping again. And they'd be there for like 5-15 minutes, whatever. And they just tag that thing and then follow it back to wherever it came from.
Yeah. And
again, like you said, Senior Airman Pena, or, you know, Captain Ghost Rider in the back of the freaking AC-130 gunship. And look how all that came together just because some guy asked a question. And Pena probably did the same thing. Well, wait a minute. What about this? It's all about asking the right questions.
It is. Yeah. And it's about keeping aware of what's going on. General North at the time had a great perspective of the theater. It just wasn't Iraq and Afghanistan. One of the big victories that you'll never hear about was the Dubai Air Show, late 2007, I believe, November, December 2007. Dubai Air Show is kind of like the Paris Air Show.
Yeah, it's a big deal in the Middle East. Really big deal.
Big deal. Well, there was a bad guy that wanted to blow up the air show. He had like over 20,000 pounds of ammonium nitrate fertilizer somewhere in a big city close to where the air show location was. That's part of U.S. CENTCOM's AOR. So how are we going to find this stuff, right?
Yeah.
So what we did, and ISR is so key in this, there's multispectral analysis and multispectral capabilities where you can sniff out ammonium nitrates. I don't know how it works. We were able to do that and give the intelligence to the Emirati police, who went out and actually got the guy. He wanted to blow up the air show. That was one of our big victories. Actually, we were so happy when that, we got that guy and brought him to justice. It was an amazing story. But those techniques, multispectral analysis, the intelligence, surveillance, and reconnaissance capabilities, you got to have a PhD level understanding of how to sequence these different techniques to be the most effective, most efficient. Yeah. And there's weapons school instructors at Nellis that know how to do that. They know how to do it from space-based assets. They know how to do it from air-breathing assets. Bringing these guys together, getting them to talk with the guys on the ground or at sea that need these capabilities. A lot of the guys doing the maneuver on the ground don't even know these capabilities exist. But if we have really good, strong liaisons with the ground component, between the air component and ground component and the naval component, good liaisons can figure out and bring these two capabilities together to help the commander achieve his objective. In this case, it was General North trying to keep that Dubai air show safe, and he did. We were able to get the assets that they needed to effect capture. That wasn't easy to do. That was hard to do, but we did it. It was an interagency effort, and it worked.
And think about the trust that you created by doing that.
Yeah, it was an amazing experience.
Hey, talk to us about the Battle of Musa Kela.
Oh, Musa Kela?
Why Musa Kela?
Yeah.
And what happened there? Okay. Because this is something that you can find on Google, or believe it or not, and Wikipedia, but nobody talks about it. It's one of those things like you were talking about. Nobody talks about this battle. Nobody talks about this battle. But I think the Battle of Musa Kela was really, really important in Afghanistan for a whole bunch of reasons. And I know that you were involved in that.
Musa Kela, Helmand province, the Helmand River. Musa Kela is a town. At the time, I think it was about 15,000 people, civilians that lived in the town. It's in the middle of nowhere, right? It's in the middle of nowhere. But at the time, it was the Taliban's main center for finance. Musa Kela was their Wall Street, if you will. This is where all the funding for the opium trade would go on, the drug trade, and this is where they would get paid. So Musa Kela was really important. And at the time, this was in November or December, all these battles took place. I think this was around Thanksgiving time in 2007. Yeah. I think it was CNN Europe, or was it the BBC? I can't remember which station had a really good documentary. It could have been Al Jazeera as well. Al Jazeera is a really good, in my opinion, Their journalism is brilliant. But they told the story. It was one of those, I can't remember, it may have been CNN Europe, but I just can't remember Sluggo. But they did a great documentary on the whole battle. And we did a 2-week ISR soak before the battle. We identified in the town where the 750 fighters would be. And that's a lot. 750, that's like a battalion, right? That's a lot of soldiers on the ground. And they're mixed
That's
up
a lot of cards in a deck.
Yeah, that's 15,000 civilians. And General North wanted to take, to support the commander of forces in Afghanistan. His name was ISAF, commander of ISAF forces, International Security Assistance Force, ISAF. How do you do that? So we did what we did in Baghdad. We had a 2-week ISR soak. We stacked the deck with space-based capabilities. We identified the rat lines. We identified all the positions in the town. We saw where they're digging in. And we were expecting a really bloody fight. This was not going to be pretty. President Karzai, who was the president of Afghanistan at the time, wanted his Afghan army to take the town. He did not want NATO forces for obvious reasons. So this 2-week ISR soak took place. We identified the battle space, had a really good feel for it. When the Afghan army started massing in the west and started moving on the town, those 750 Taliban fighters fled the town. They didn't even fight. Don't know why. Still don't know why they didn't fight. They just left the town. And we were able to take the town of Musa Kayla without firing a shot, without any civilians being killed. Amazing. Because we had Dimpy's points of impact for JDAMs all around the town to take out these fighters. We were expecting a lot of casualties. Not a single civilian was killed, Sluggo. That battle was over pretty much without a fight. The Afghan army went into town. They raised the Afghan flag in the middle of the town square. The 750 fighters fled to the north, if I remember correctly. Mm-hmm. And that's where our special forces guys were waiting for them. And that's where the real battle took place. But none of the civilians were killed. It was just an amazing story. It's Colonel Seth Brescher, who was the commander of the Joint Operations Center in Kabul. He was been there for a year. Colonel Brescher said that was the Battle of Musa Kayla was my proudest time there. Thanks to the guys at the air component that helped bring it to fruition in a way that it did. It's just, I still can't believe that took place. But you can see the documentary on, I think it's CNN Europe, if I remember right.
I'll try and find it, Tazz, and I'll link to it in the show notes for this episode, so that all the listeners can go to it and find it. Okay.
It's an hour-long documentary. It talks about the Afghan army moving into position, and they get all the credit, rightfully so. They were on the ground where they should be. Doesn't say much about what the air component did, but that's okay. We weren't there to get any glory. We wanted the Afghans to get their town back, and they did. Amazing.
How are you going to use air power? That's a lot of DIMPs, desired mean points of impact. In other words, where the bomb's going to hit for all of our listeners. That takes a lot of coordination and a lot of thinking also. And of course, collateral damage is one of the biggest things you got to think of too, because you don't want to blow down the house next to you. All right. And if I remember right, I think the 500-pound JDAMs were just coming online, weren't they?
They were, and they had JDAMs, different classes of JDAMs, and I'm an F-15C guy, so what do I know what I'm saying here, right? But we also had some inert JDAMs, which means it's just a blivet that doesn't go boom. It's just the impact and the shock of a weapon going over 600 miles an hour through a concrete roof of a building that can stun people long enough for special forces to go in and take the guys out. We had all kinds of weapons, Sluggo. It just wasn't JDAMs. The A-10s were there with their 30 millimeter guns. Mm-hmm. They were amazing. But yeah, we needed to concentrate that firepower when we needed it. And the B-1 was the bomb truck of the fight in Afghanistan. The B-52s the B-52s weren't there. They were there in the opening days after 9/11 back in 2001. But when I was there, the B-1, the bone, as we called it, was affectionately also known as the bomb truck because they carried a lot of ordnance, and they can
85 500-pound bombs, 85 JDAMs.
They can hang out.
Something like that. It's ridiculous.
They can dwell, and they can stay on station for a significant amount of time. So we use those. We use the B-1s a lot in Afghanistan. Not so much in Iraq. Afghanistan was where all the kinetic fires were. In Iraq, we were more into capturing guys, at least the fights we were in. We were rounding guys up and not necessarily wiping them out like we did in Afghanistan.
See, we used the bone as a bomb truck too during the invasion. And we put them on what we called X attack, on-call attack, Tazz. The attack on the Mansour district where we thought Saddam was a bone. Yeah. And what they did is they had JDAM penetrators in the front, the JDAM Mark 84 big boys in the middle, and they had the CBU 105 wind-corrected munition dispenser with sensor fuse weapons in the back. And so you had this airplane up there carrying all these weapons, 24 of these weapons of different kinds, sizes that you could do different things with. That was one of the great things about the bone. Oh, and it's got a sniper pod on it too. So it can gather intelligence and do marking and do all that kind of stuff and record all of that. And it was perfect for that. Was it efficient? Probably not. It's soaking up gas, doing all that kind of stuff, hanging out. Was it effective? Absolutely. Because whenever something popped up like a TST, like when they thought Saddam was in the Mansour district, that thing raced up there and did the deed. So I know the bone does a lot of great things. The B-52 does too. Don't get me wrong, but being able to put 3 different weapons inside the bone, have an offensive, defensive guy, their whole job is just to sit there, look at the video, say, okay, we're going to use a penetrator here. We're going to use a wick mid here. That was a big deal. Big deal. What's it like flying the Eagle, man?
Superman wears a cape. He's able to, stop bullets, fly faster than a speeding bullet, and jump over tall buildings. That's what it feels like when you're flying an Eagle. You are invincible. Nobody can touch you. It's quite a feeling. It was an amazing experience. Got over 2,300 hours in the F-15. It was great. I was in 4 different operational F-15 squadrons in the Western Pacific and in the States, and met a lot of great people. Great Americans. It was quite a machine. It was a great airplane. You didn't even think about flying it. You thought more about employing the airplane as a weapon, optimizing its radar, looking for a weapon solution. You didn't even think about putting the gear down and maintaining airspeed. When you landed, when you shot an ILS down to minimums, you break out right at 200-foot ceilings, a half mile, or 301 was what we normally flew down to. But yeah. That was the mins for the Air Force at the time, 300-foot ceilings, 1 mile viz. You didn't even think about flying it. The airplane was that good and that easy to fly. But it was a difficult airplane to max perform and get the most out of as a weapon system. And that's where the big challenge was, where to look with your radar, where to sort things out, how to identify guys, listening to the communications going on, listening to the targeting plan, putting a 9 or 8.5 9G brake turn when you need it with the lift vector in the right position. Those were really hard to do. But flying the airplane, it was great. I mean, it was just amazing. I'm not going to lie. It was fantastic. Yeah, it was a great airplane. It was a very lethal air-to-air machine as well. And it still is.
Let's talk about lethality for just a second, because you flew in the first Gulf War with just Sparrows and Sidewinders, and then later on transitioned to AMRAAM's Sparrows and Sidewinders, didn't you?
Yep.
What kind of an impact did the AMRAAM have on the way you employed the airplane, its lethality?
Well, you could write a whole book on that, Slogo. Yeah. It increased its.
That's why I asked the question.
You could write a whole book on that. It increased its effectiveness in combat. Oh, geez. I don't even want to give a number. I'm here to tell you, I would have had 2 kills. I would have had 2 MiG-29 kills if I had AIM-120s on my wing in the first Gulf War. I know that. I was carrying AIM-7 Sparrows, which is a great missile, but the AMRAAM, the AIM-120, has a lot longer range. Yeah, it's significant capability. And it is an active, has its own active radar seeker, so you don't need to illuminate the target with the mothership radar, the radar-guided missile, to impact the target. In other words, the missile's on its own. It's autonomous. Once you fire it, you can forget it, and it'll find the target. We couldn't do that in the first Gulf War with the weapons we had.
And I'm sure when that missile gets to a certain point, its target isn't going to escape.
You got to get you got to fire it within the right parameters to optimize the ability and maximize its lethality as a weapon. You just can't go out there and do it without a lot of thought behind pulling that trigger. Because when you pull that trigger, you're taking somebody's life, and that life needs to end for a reason that's a lot bigger than me and you right now. But you got to think about all these things before you go into combat. In my opinion, it worked for me when I was flying the Eagle. It's not a topic. Fighter pilots talk about flying airplanes, and having a great time. They don't talk about heart-to-heart stuff very much, which is just as well. It's not who we are. It's not how the guys are now. My son is flying an F-16 in the Air Force, and they just don't talk about
the human aspect.
The human aspect of it. We're all in this together, and we're here to serve something bigger than ourselves. Take a lot of pride in doing that. But yeah, the Gulf War, after that experience, flying in the airlines now, I'm talking with guys that flew F-111s in some of the missions that I escorted. I talked with an AC-130 pilot who knew Spirit 03. That was the AC-130 that was shot down. He knew the crew. And I flew with this captain over a 4-day, we fly 4-day trips. Typically, it's a 4-day, 3 to 4 days, whatever. But you get to know this guy really well. And then you never see him again, but you become best friends.
Yeah.
And he knew the crew of the AC-130 gunship that was shot down. He knew him real well. And I've had some great talks, and it gives me a really good perspective looking back on these things and talking with these guys that I didn't know I escorted on missions, over 30 years ago. And
isn't that amazing?
Yeah, it's an amazing experience, but we still talk about it like it was yesterday.
A member of that crew on that AC-130 gunship was a BYU grad. I knew him well.
Yeah.
Bill Grimm. And that's the whole reason why they don't fly during the daytime anymore, was because of that one incident. For the listeners out there, AC-130 gunship during the first Gulf War got shot down. Actually, the whole crew went down with the airplane into the water, into the Northern Arabian Gulf, killed everybody after it had been sighted down low by an Iraqi with a shoulder-fired missile that took it down and killed everybody on board. And its call sign was Spirit 03. Yeah, I imagine you get to fly with some guys from all kinds of varying backgrounds. Some guys have no military experience. Some guys have a lot of military experience. It must be fascinating doing that.
It's just amazing. The conversation came up. One guy in the cockpit and the flight deck asked me, how come, Spirit Airlines is here flying? We mentioned Spirit 03. Well, there's Spirit Airlines flying now, but their call sign in the air is Spirit Wings. And the guy looks at me and goes, how come they call themselves Spirit Wings? Why don't they just call themselves Spirit? Because they're Spirit Airlines. And I said, because Spirit is the call sign of the AC-130 gunship out of Hurlburt Airfield that I'm familiar with. So I think, I'm not sure. I mean, I don't make up all the rules, but I'm pretty sure that's why Spirit Airlines, the radio call sign is Spirit Wings and not Spirit, because the AC-130 still use Spirit.
Yeah, they do. And believe it or not, you know what? During the war in Afghanistan, during Anaconda, they were using the call sign Grim, which was my buddy's last name. Yeah.
So it's been great. It's been a great experience. I'm flying now at a local glider port, and I'm one of the young guys. I'm 60 years old, but I'm one of the young guys at the glider field. A lot of these guys are old pilots. A lot of them are engineers with a pilot's license. They worked in the space program. And Sluggo, these guys are in their 70s and 80s. I'm not making this up. They're 70s and 80-year-old men in their 80s. The oldest guy there is in his early 90s. And God bless them all. They're flying airplanes, and they're healthy. They're loving life. And I look at aviation now as I age. I was a young fighter pilot with my hair on fire years ago. Now I'm looking at, what am I going to do when I leave the airlines? I want to be that 80-year-old glider instructor teaching some 17-year-old kid how to thermal and find lift in a sailplane. I want to be that guy, because there's guys like that, great Americans with a lot of experience.
I want to thank Tazz for being on. He and I go back a long ways, and during those intense times, you form a camaraderie with people around you. Tazz has become a lifelong friend. We've talked to each other as we were deployed at all kinds of different locations, and he was even a student at the Joint Forces Staff College at one of my seminars. I think one of the big lessons learned that Tazz wanted to share with us was go after it. They didn't sit down and hunker down in their buildings. They went out and fought the enemy, found them, fixed them, and finished them, as the Army would say. I guess that's something I tell all of you out there as a life lesson too. Be proactive, get involved. You go to war with the Army you have, not the Army you want. Take the opportunity to use all those tools that you have and conquer the problem. Punch it in the face, kick it in the you-know-where, get the job done. Special thanks to Wall Pilot once again for being the sponsor of this show. Custom aviation art for the walls of your home, office, or hangar. And I'll have some F-15s in the show notes that you can purchase off of Wall Pilot's website. This and previous episodes are all found at my website, markhasera.com. And please go and subscribe and share these episodes with your friends and loved ones. On next week's show, I interview a gal who flew F-16s, was an instructor in T-38s, but she also flew with the Air Force demonstration team, the Thunderbirds. And we're going to listen to her tell us what her lessons learned flying combat missions in the Middle East and flying with the Thunderbirds. Thanks again for listening in today, and I hope you have a great week.